I was 11 years old the first time I was catcalled. I was pulling out of the garage on my bike, heading for youth group on a Wednesday afternoon. Because, see, as a preteen, I was one of this weird 1%, maybe half of 1%. I was a kid who took myself to church alone. And in my small town, that was like still kind of normative and okay, and adults weren't like, where's your adult? But every day, by foot or by bike, especially Wednesday afternoons and Sunday mornings, I went by myself. And the adults down the street at the United Methodist Church told me how great it was to see me. And I'm just a disaster this morning. Hang on. This is my life. No, this is my life. I try really hard to, be polished. Ask my students. It's just, this is me. I was so excited to get up here, but let's get a restart again. All right, 11 years old. Leave out of my garage. I'm catcalled for the first time on the way to the church. The church where this beautiful collection of adults, even though I came by myself, would look at me and say, we're so happy to have you because your simple presence here is a witness and a testament to the glory of God. And the great thing about being 11 is that you totally believe people when they tell that to you. I was like, of course it is. Of course I am. Yes, exactly. And I count myself lucky to have spent my childhood in a church, and the vast majority of my life as a church person, even with the baggage that may come with it, because I had that singularly wonderful experience of being a little kid in church, where like everyone there is an angel to give you silently unwrapped butterscotches. Right? You know who they are, absolutely. Some of the earliest memories I have are of being a little girl in lacy socks and lacy dresses that matched, sitting on the floor, a cold asbestos tile against the back of my legs, in the upstairs too-hot nursery classroom on an August morning. Some of the earliest memories and most precious memories I have of Christmas are of going to the 11 p.m. service, because my parents were sticklers, and now I am too with my kid, but the 11 p.m. service, trying desperately to stay awake, failing every time, falling asleep, and then waking up to the sound of my congregation singing over me in the candlelight. I am so fortunate. I count myself so lucky to have been a church kid. But on that Wednesday morning when I was 11, something shifted. And I don't remember the content of what my harasser said, just the feeling that followed after it, because it was a feeling that I ended up getting pretty familiar with, and it was that my cheeks got real hot, and my stomach got really cold. And I pedaled away from him as fast as I could, and still to this day, I'm not sure whether I was crying. There were tears running down my face, and I don't know if I was crying because it was really upsetting, or if just like, you're a kid, you ride your bike real fast, and the wind pushes all of the liquid out of your eye. I'm not sure which. And youth group went fine. It was unremarkable. That in and of itself is a blessing, because I know for many young women who would have gone and said, this just happened to me, they would have been asked what they were wearing or whether, lots of other things. I was told, I'm very sorry that happened. I was told that shouldn't have happened. I was told that he was a rude man. You're going to have to try not to let it get to you. But the next Sunday, as we sang of Jesus and Father God, and we talked of the biblical heroes that were usually almost always men, I looked at the rainbows playing on the carpet from the stained glass, which was my favorite thing to do, as church was going on, and I remember I had a single thought cross my head. What if God has more in common with that rude man than with me? It took about 18 years for me to find words for what happened that Wednesday. The best way I found to describe it is that it marked my crossing into this intersection of having a woman's body, a cis woman's body, in the same as the life of the church. Because those things for me are now completely interwoven and intersection and can never be taken apart. Because when I moved from a child's body in the church to a woman's body in the church, In what felt like a snap of the fingers, I went from being told, "You are so wonderful, and we are glad you're here. Your presence is an image of God, no reservations." And then I crossed into the intersection where there were now a lot of reservations, actually. They were small, but they added up. So I got instructions in youth group about the appropriate way to hug, which we know is the Christian side hug. Because if you're aware of your own or another person's breasts, well, church is canceled. Right? I started being a counselor at a Christian camp down the road, and I remember getting instructions, girls, like the bra straps have to be covered, the shorts had to be a certain amount of length. Guys got some spotty instructions about stuff. Their underwear were easily 2 inches out of their pants. Nobody was worried about their underwear, but there were some vague things about taking off your hat during prayers. And I didn't realize that was gendered, so once during lunch I took off my hat for a prayer, and somebody tapped me on the shoulder and was like, "Hey, you don't have to take off your hat, you're a girl." And I was like, right. Because God is not worried about my hat, just my underwear. And it's hilarious and it's heartbreaking. The other thing you know about small towns, if you're from them or love people from them, you just go where there's a critical mass of youth. Because there's not enough youth for all of us to have fully functioning youth groups. We're all split up. And so the best vacation Bible school was at the ELCA church. And then I went to the Methodist church on Sunday mornings. And I went to the First Christian church on Wednesday afternoons once I hit high school, because they had the critical mass of cool kids and the best pizza. That's where we went. And what that meant is that my pastors and my youth pastors, they would see me doing things like excelling on the volleyball court. Don't laugh. I was a defensive specialist, okay? But they would come to my games where I was in a volleyball uniform, racerback tee, spandex. That's what we practiced in also. And I would get these big, sweaty, victorious, yay, you're going to sectionals hugs from these leaders who I adored, while also knowing that on Wednesdays, it was really important that I not go home and grab a snack between practice and youth group. It was important that I bring clothes in my car so I would have time to change before I walked into the meeting hall. Because my body, while great on the court, was a huge problem in the church. And I would be asked to leave. So I also got things like, it's a shame you're a girl because you'd make a great preacher. I was actually told a few different times how I would make a great preacher's wife, which is where the baggage comes from, because I did accidentally marry a pastor. It's a shorter story than you think, but the message that I got from the church coming up, becoming a woman in a woman's body, was clear. Bodies are important to God. And my woman's body was powerful. It was so powerful that because it was female, it could stop a divine call. Because of what my body was, not the right one, God just had to say, sorry, I'll send someone else. Bodies, I learned, were important because the body you were in determined how useful you were and where that use found its worth. And thankfully, Jesus is bigger than what we talk about in any of our churches. Amen. Because obviously I'm not there anymore, because that's not Jesus. That story about why bodies are important to God, that's not Jesus. Bodies are important to God. They're so important that our main story as Christians is of what happened when God took on a body, and the type of body that God chose to inhabit, and the body that God chose to carry that incarnation. The first person who knew about our defining moment as Christians was Mary, a young, unmarried woman living in an occupied imperialist territory whose worth was defined by her relationships to men, her father, her future husband, and any sons she may bear for her insurance and security in her older age. It was this Mary from whom God first sought consent. I believe that there is consent in the story of the Annunciation, and I understand that there are really great commentaries to the opposite, but for me, I see clear consent in the story of the Annunciation. God could have showed up 9 months later the way Zeus does and was like, right, that one's mine, No, we get an announcement at the beginning, and it was that Mary whose father was not asked, whose fiance was not asked, told later after the effect. By the way, it was that Mary from whom God sought consent, and it was that Mary who, seeking counsel from no one else, said, yes, let it be unto me as you have said. And it was that Mary who was promised to bear the Christ child, that her name would be known among the earth and called blessed. She was not promised survival. She's not a stupid woman. She knew the mortality rate that goes along with breaking and bringing a new life into the world. She was not promised to survive the birth of this child, and yet she said yes and risked everything. And afterwards, it was this Mary who first preached the gospel after God's good news came to earth in the flesh. The good news that came to earth first in her flesh, because that's how human bodies work. Her flesh that broke and bled in order to give new life to the world. And it was this Jesus that she bore, who defied gender stereotypes and societal norms to break bread with sinful women. It was this Jesus who we were found really important as we passed the story on to include sex workers in his genealogy, plural. It was this Jesus whose flesh broke and bled to bring new life into the world. And yet it was that Jesus and that Mary that every time we talked about brothers, that every time it was only he, him, and his, that every time I heard you'd make a great preacher if you weren't a girl, it was those that got farther and farther and farther removed from me, even as a lifelong church kid, way beyond arm's length, way beyond understanding, way beyond identifying with. The stuff we did to Mary, you'll have to buy the book to read more, but the stuff we did to Mary, we made her, in our reverence for her, Protestants were all afraid of her, rightfully so, but you should get with her. Catholics and others who have kept Mary because have so revered her that she became almost inhuman and untouchable. First, Mary was represented to me when I was a kid as a really young person, and look, young people can do good stuff for God too, hooray. And then as I approached, I got into that intersection of having a woman's body. And then it was about her obedience and her chastity, and her obedience and her chastity, and her chastity and her chastity. And so then as I grew and I became someone, who was in a married relationship and, didn't have the chastity thing going for me anymore, Mary and I had even less to talk about at a cocktail party, so far away. But there was this moment when it all became real to me, when I was shoved back into my body and saw theirs in a different way. And it was 3 o'clock in the morning. Why do all good stories start at 3 o'clock in the morning? It was 3 o'clock in the morning, and I was awake and alone and sick. Because 3 days prior, I had a baby who was still at the hospital, and he was sick too. So instead of bringing him home and hanging out with him at 3 o'clock in the morning, I had what I call the world's saddest consolation prize, which was this big industrial beige box of a hospital-grade breast pump that I got to wrestle with. No, don't make sad faces, guys. It was amazing. No, it wasn't, but no sad faces necessary. I was wrestling with that, and in my sleep-deprived and Percocet-addled state, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. And even though for me it happened when I was postpartum, it's a moment that you all have had or will have. It's coming for you. It doesn't have to be about pregnancy. Because I saw myself in the mirror and I thought, oh, I don't know who that person is. I didn't recognize myself. And others of us have that. You look in the mirror and suddenly your dad's face is there, or a grandparent, or there are marks, or there's something that happens that you just don't recognize or feel like yourself in your own body. And it wasn't a moment of shame, but as I was washing things in the sink, I looked up and I thought, whoa, this is my body. Okay. And then because I have a theological imagination from that grounding in the church, from being a little kid gazing at rainbows, and because I was on a lot of Percocet and hadn't been sleeping, I heard the voice of all the communion celebrants I'd ever heard say, "This is my body broken for you. This is my blood shed for you," as the green bubbles washed down the sink. And I thought, wait, my body just broke. My body is still bleeding. And there's a new life in a room somewhere else that didn't exist before. That'll preach. And then I thought, why hasn't anyone preached that at me before? This seems helpful. This seems valuable, not just for women, but like that's how it happens, that it's not this far distant thing, that this is how we all got here. Because a body broke and blood shed to bring us here. That was a way for me to grasp more permanently, more tangibly what happened when God chose to have a body, because it was so important to God. Other bodies can have these moments, either where you feel pushed out of it and unwelcome, or sometimes in places of grace, radically brought back in. And it's that part, that place where we get to radically bring ourselves back in, that I think we have to start finding more and more regularly, both within the walls of the church and out on the street in our lives, if we have any hope for moving forward into the times that are facing us. And I don't mean February, I mean all of it. All of it. The language that we use in the church can either serve to draw us in, as we experienced so beautifully this morning, or push us out. And so including language that includes bodies or evokes bodies that we can connect with, bodies that are often sidelined, yes, women's bodies, yes, trans bodies, disabled bodies, fat bodies, elderly bodies, Black and indigenous and mixed bodies, okay? We have to find ways to get back into ourselves, because I don't know how we reach out without having to get back in first. Because when we have an opportunity to proclaim, "This is my body," without shame or caveat or feelings of displacement, we are making a gospel proclamation, because of course we are. We are people of the incarnation. I have it on my arm this morning. This is temporary. I may get bold enough one day to make it permanent. I briefly led a service at Wild Goose Festival this year where we got an opportunity to put these on our bodies. And I couldn't believe what happened in that moment, where people placed "This is my body" across a self-harm scar. Where people placed "This is my body," women who had also been raised in really oppressive traditions, across their collarbone, near their breast, which they had been told to hide or minimize or bind or anything else. When people who had been pushed out of the church because of who they were in themselves asked someone else, because they'd been dismembered from the body of Christ, "Can you put this on me?" And another member in the body of Christ remembered them back in. Because I wholly believe, in spite of myself sometimes, that this is the gospel truth that will carry us forward and sustain us. That when we can own our God-given bodies and receive the God-given bodies of others, and then somehow find grace to offer them wholly and without reserve to each other, that is when we are transformed into what happens at God's heavenly banquet table. Because the radical thing about the incarnation in our Christ is that this is somehow sufficient still. This bread and cup, that's somehow alone sufficient. When we can do this, "This is my body," We will meet at God's great feasting table, as we have all done so many times before. There, where God's great work is finished among us. But there, where God's great work is begun as well. Amen.